Hello everyone, welcome back. If you're enjoying the story so far, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to my channel. And if you've got any friends that you think would also enjoy the story, please share it with them. Chapter 6. Joe hurried his precious cargo towards the coast, and it wasn't long before they could hear the frustrated cries of hungry gulls overhead. As they trundled down to the busy docks, Maya peered through a crack and caught a glimpse of a huge monstrosity of a ship. It reminded her of a newspaper cutting her brother had saved of a snapshot of the maiden voyage of a huge pleasure liner with a grandiose name that in that exact moment she couldn't quite recall. Its long black riveted hull seemed to stretch for as far as the eye could see, and two great chimney stacks painted pillar box red and belching thick plumes of dark smoke protruded proudly from its deck. The cart pulled up alongside a number of other vehicles, both horse-drawn and motorised, waiting to board. Maya turned back around and whispered to the Spriggans. "Where does Bupcher live again?" "A long way away," Pete whispered in response, before Catherine put a hand on his shoulder and raised a finger to her lips. Maya peered out again, trying to take in as much as she could. From the angle the cart was parked at, she could see the side of a tall crane, unloading a cargo of long wooden crates from the hold. A gang of trolls were busy receiving these crates and moving them onto a set of tracks that led up to a cargo train. One creature in particular stood out to Maya. It was twice the size of any of the trolls and completely hairless. Its rough-looking skin had a green and brown hue to it, and it wore large iron shackles around its wrists and ankles. It looked to Maya to be the stuff of nightmares, but it was obvious why the trolls kept it around. It took two of them, puffing and straining with all their might, to simply lift one of these crates off the floor, whereas by comparison this larger beast was carrying two by himself and not even breaking a sweat. He was strong enough to fit one under each arm and made light work of the short journey from the track to the train. What's more, he seemed to be enjoying himself, skipping along and whistling a merry tune as he worked. As he joyfully collected another two crates, he turned a little too sharply and slipped on the wet dock. His big flat foot shot out from under him and he crashed down onto one knee, losing his grip on the crate under his right arm. It hit the floor with a crack, spilling its precious contents out across the slippery stones. 20 or so long cylinders that looked to Maya like huge copper pencils rolled clear of the crate and down towards the hull of the ship. The foreman of the trolls gave a terrific shout and the rest of the workers dove for cover. As the last of the giant cylinders clattered against the side of the ship, nobody moved. A tense few seconds passed, and then slowly, one by one, the trolls came out from their hiding places, mopping their sweaty brows and looking ever so relieved. The foreman marched straight up to the large creature and cuffed him around the ear. "You stupid oaf! You could have blown the entire dock to smithereens and had us all killed. For heaven's sake, look where you're going next time." The large creature rubbed his swollen ear and after repacking the crate, went to stand with the other workers waiting to load the carts and vehicles onto the ship. A whistle sounded and they set about their new task. The large creature, a long strand of drool hanging from its mouth, headed straight for Joe's cart. The gnomes heard Joe shift above them in his seat and call out, "No, not you. You go help one of the others. You'll scare the horse. Go on, shoo." As the creature, who up close was even uglier than Joe, got within about 3 feet of the cart, he suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly and his nostrils began to flare. Joe continued to holler at the ugly brute. "Go on now, shoo, go on." The beast's eyes suddenly rolled back in his head and he started to grunt and wave his arms about. "Mr. Foreman," Joe called out, "I can't have this ogre around my cart. Can't you see he's upsetting the horse?" Maya suddenly felt Pete at her shoulder, his demeanour sharp and urgent. "Oh, goodness. Did Joe say ogre?" he whispered. "We're in real trouble now." Maya was suddenly surrounded by the other gnomes, who began bundling her up in as much of their spare clothes as they could. The foreman stopped directing the traffic and came over. "What's going on here?" he said wearily. He had the look of a troll that hadn't slept for weeks. "Can't you see? Your ogre's gone doolally," Joe called out. "What's an ogre doing working in a dockyard anyway?" "I'm terribly sorry, sir," the foreman called back. "He's a grim, so we have to keep him around. He's simple in the head, you see, so this is the only type of work he's good for, and even that's being kind." The ogre's tongue smacked its lips and long strings of saliva dangled from the sides of its mouth. It was pointing to the cart and trying desperately to get the foreman's attention. Get away from the cart, you horrible beast, the foreman shouted. A group of trolls rushed over and grabbed the wild ogre. Chain him up and throw away the key. I don't care who he's cousins with, the foreman shouted after them. The ogre's eyes grew wider and wilder the further away from the cart it was dragged. Suddenly, it let out a blood-curdling roar and broke free. Stop that ogre! The foreman screamed. The creature leapt up onto the back of the cart and began hurling barrels of grog down onto the cobbles. Some of the gnomes screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the tremendous racket outside. One of the barrels landed with a loud crack, sending grog spilling out all over the dock. Mr. Foreman, Joe shouted. My cargo! The embarrassed foreman blew madly on his whistle until a whole gang of trolls had surrounded the wild beast. It thrashed around in the grips of a wild frenzy, but eventually the army of trolls managed to wrestle it away. We'll see you get remunerated for that barrel, sir, even if it comes out of my wages, the foreman said apologetically. See that you do, Joe replied curtly as the weary-looking troll shuffled off. Pete slumped down next to Maya and wiped his sweaty brow. That was too close for comfort, he said. But before anyone could say anything else, the cart lurched forwards and up the ramp and into the cargo hold of the ship. What was that thing? Maya whispered, unwrapping herself and handing back the various items of clothing. Never you mind, Catherine said, clutching Lily to her chest. Let's just hope we don't run into any more. Lily, who'd amazingly slept through the entire commotion, opened her eyes and yawned. Are we there yet? She said sleepily. Not yet, darling, Catherine said with a nervous smile. We've reached the ship. Isn't that exciting? Your first boat ride. Can we get out and have a look, Mama? Maybe another time, Catherine said and shook her head. Lily, looking disappointed, lay back down and closed her eyes. The cart came to an abrupt stop and they heard Joe jump down from his seat and walk around to the back. He pretended to inspect one of the back wheels as he bent his head close to the secret compartment. Journey will last all night, so get some sleep, he whispered. I'm taking Bluebell off to get fed and watered, and then get a few hours shut-eye myself, so I'll see you in the morning. Pete put his head close to the hatch and whispered hard. But what about if we need to, relieve ourselves? The hatch slid back abruptly, and a bucket clattered down, almost hitting Maya on the head. The gnomes looked around at each other with horrified expressions. The hatch slid shut, and then Joe whispered again. We'll stop off tomorrow, somewhere discreet so you can stretch your legs and get some fresh air. Joe's boots clumped around to the front of the cart, and they heard the sounds of the old horse being uncoupled. A moment later, the heavy door to the lower deck clanged shut, and the powerful engines roared into life. It was so noisy and cramped that Maya wondered if she'd ever get any decent rest. The dimensions of the smuggler's compartment had been designed with the maximum height of a gnome in mind, which meant that even the tallest of gnomes could lay down comfortably without bumping their head. But for Maya, this meant that either her feet and knees were up in the air, or her head and neck were bent at a crooked angle. I suppose I don't really need the sleep, she told herself. I've done nothing but sleep recently, and besides, I'm far too uncomfortable. Despite these reassurances, she decided she ought to at least make the effort. But every time she'd feel herself on the cusp of dropping off, cramp in her legs or a numb bottom would keep her awake. At some point, she gave up trying altogether and sat up. The boat was listing slowly from side to side with a steady rhythm that, combined with the incessant chugging of the engine and the stuffiness of the compartment, was starting to make her feel quite sick. But even so, she wasn't about to start feeling sorry for herself. She was in no doubt that she'd rather be here than a prisoner of the old house and at the mercy of those incessant jackdaws beyond her window. She wondered if the staff would still be looking for her, or if they'd have given up by now. Maybe they'd found a way to get a message to her brother. Perhaps he'd been recalled from the front and put in charge of leading the search party to find her, and all she had to do to be reunited with him was to get back to the coombe. But at that very moment, the thought of getting home seemed like the most impossible task. She briefly entertained the idea of blaming Gruff, but a pang of guilt jolted her back into her right mind. Silly Maya, she chided herself. It wasn't Gruff's fault. How was he to know you were going to end up cooped up here inside this smuggler's compartment? Everything always seems worse in the dead of night, her grandfather used to say. The sun always rises, even if it's too cloudy to see. She closed her eyes again and took a couple of deep breaths. Just the thought of her grandfather made her feel much calmer. At some point she slipped across into that strange place where one is neither fully awake nor fast asleep. Images flashed through her tired mind. Her grandfather standing proudly next to his new tractor in the orchard. Will carrying the ladder from the shed, her hands reaching up to pick the bitter round apples, her toes on the edge of the long step. Maya woke with a start at the sound of the ship's horn as it approached port. The low rumble of the horn filled her ears and reverberated through the cart. The sounds of hustle and bustle in the lower decks soon returned, and before long they heard the clip and clop of Joe's horse as he led it back to the cart, recoupled it, and clambered up into his seat. And then they were off again, another step closer to their new life. After an hour or so, Catherine leant over to Pete and whispered, "Weren't we supposed to stop so we could stretch our legs?" "Well, I'm sure Joe's just making sure he finds a safe place, that's all," Pete said, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But they didn't stop. Not for the whole day, and not until nightfall. And by that point, more than one of the gnomes had to use the bucket, much to everyone's embarrassment. The ground underneath the wheels of the cart began to get rockier, and the gnomes were all chucked about uncontrollably. The bucket threatened more than once to tip over and spill its unpleasant contents right into their laps. When at last they finally did stop, they were all mightily relieved. The barrels of grog shifted overhead, and the hatch slid back, and a rush of cold, fresh air hit their nostrils. Stiff and exhausted, one by one, they clambered out into the cold night. As they helped each other down off the back of the cart, they began to take in their surroundings. The cart was pulled up on the side of a narrow dirt track next to a thick pine forest. The trees loomed thick and black all around them. And while the gnomes took to stretching and sneaking off to find a tree to crouch behind, Maya noticed Joe shifting the barrels back into place. "That's odd," she thought. "He'll only have to move them again once we have to climb back in." After replacing the last one, he climbed back down into the driver's seat and took up the reins. When all the gnomes had finished their business, they huddled together next to the cart to keep warm. Pete was the first to speak. "All right then, Joe. I think we're about ready to get back in now." "There's been a change of plan," Joe said, staring straight ahead. "I don't understand," Pete replied. "From here, you'll go on foot through the forest, and one of my associates will meet you on the other side." "But that wasn't part of the agreement, Joe. You're supposed to take us all the way to Bupshire yourself," Pete protested uncertainly. "Nothing I can do, me old mucker. No way through from here. Had to use a different route to avoid a hidden checkpoint," the troll said, still not making eye contact. "And there's no way the cart and horse will fit through that thick forest." There were lots of uncomfortable murmurs from the gnomes as they glanced around uncertainly at one another. "Just go straight on through, and he'll be waiting for you on the other side. You can't miss him," Joe Trammell said, and before the gnomes had time to reply, he'd whipped the reins of his old horse, and the cart took off down the muddy track. For a moment, they all just stood there in disbelief. And then, one by one, they turned to stare at the dark woods. With no moon, and not even a lonely match to strike, they could hardly see each other's faces, let alone a path through the forest. "Well," Pete said, with as much enthusiasm as he could muster, "Joe's always been a good friend to the gnomes, so we've got no reason to worry. I'm sure it won't take us long to find his associate." Somewhere in the darkness, the howl of a wolf rang out, and a shiver ran down Maya's spine. "What was that, Mama?" Lily asked, squeezing hold of Catherine's hand. "Oh, it's nothing, my dear. Probably just an owl, or some other harmless thing," Catherine said, and lifting her daughter up into her arms, the party set off into the dark woods. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay indoors, and look after one another.